Thanks, Craig. Like Craig said, my name is Mark Staples. I'm the director of the Forest Service Youth Avalanche Center. And tonight I'd like to talk about early season avalanche problems. More specifically, what happens when we get weak snow in that early part of the season and then the avalanches that result in that, and how they evolved through the season. And then ultimately I want to reframe how we think about these avalanches and really reframe how we think about the entire winter season. And we're going to do that by talking about my apricot tree, where I get some seasons that are really good for apricots and others that are really bad. But back to the snow. It's a crazy thing. Like right now, the snow we have right now, the weather we're going to get is going to determine the avalanches. It's going to determine what we do for the next month, 2 months, even for the next 6 months. All of that will be determined by what happens right now. For me, when I think about this early season snow, it's deeply personal because I've been to way too many fatal avalanches involving this problem. I've literally walked in the footsteps of the people that have triggered them, in some cases the footsteps of the victims involved. And when I think about it, I remember people like Steve Green, who was parked right here beneath this grove of trees. Those are his tracks right before he pulled out into the opening to watch his buddy climb in the hill above. Or here, it was in the footsteps of ice climbers who were going up this gully and triggered an avalanche that barreled down and killed Guy Lascelles. Or even here, on New Year's Day, when Ken Gibson and his son were riding in an area called Onion Basin. I had been up at 4 a.m. that morning, writing the avalanche forecast, issuing the avalanche warning because we knew that the snow we had gotten that night had overloaded the weak snow at the ground and there'd be widespread avalanche activity. Those are Ken's tracks right before he was hit by an avalanche. And then the next day, Eric Knopf and I were flying in on this helicopter to go get Ken's body so that we could bring it back to his family. The reason I share this with you is that these stories are burned into my memory. And when I see the when I see the mountains start to get painted white with snow, I think of these avalanches and I think of these stories, and I carry them with me every day I go into the mountains. The one I carry with me the most was one that almost killed me 14 years ago. That year, it was a horrible season. We had avalanches breaking all year long on old, weak snow near the ground. There had been 6 avalanche fatalities in this area alone, and we had been tiptoeing around all season long doing our best to avoid avalanche terrain. But by April 1st, it seemed like avalanche activity had subsided. It didn't seem like avalanche season anymore, and in fact, we had been wearing shorts and t-shirts in town, which, if you've been to Montana, is actually a pretty big deal because oftentimes you don't wear shorts and t-shirts until July, it seems like. So it just didn't feel like avalanche season. And then we got this big spring snowstorm that dropped about 1.5 feet of just perfect powder. It was like a classic Utah storm. And so we decided to head to Alex Low Peak in the Gallatin Range to ski one of these couloirs. We headed all the way up one drainage, crossed a high pass, dropped into another drainage, crossed that until we got to the base of this peak. And then at the yellow arrow, we started heading up. The whole time, we had been assessing the new snow, assessing its bond with the old snow underneath. And every step of the way, we were getting a green light. There hadn't even been a breath of wind. But the one thing we weren't thinking about was that old, weak snow near the ground. I mean, it was April 1st, right? Like, at a certain point, it's got to be done. So as we climbed higher, we got up to a shoulder where we were going to traverse into the main couloir, right at that yellow X. And as we crossed that shoulder, we got a giant ka-woomph, a big collapse that was Mother Nature screaming out a warning sign. We took about a half hour to debate what it meant, but really it's pretty simple, and we knew that. We just didn't want to accept it for a little bit, so we decided to turn around and bail. The problem is that we had gone up avalanche terrain and there was only one way down through avalanche terrain. So I was ready first. I started skiing, and a couple turns in, the whole slope shattered for hundreds of feet across and 4 to 6 feet deep. And instantly I was swallowed by these giant blocks of snow and swept downhill. But here's the thing. This avalanche happened on April 1st, but it broke on old, weak, faceted snow that fell over 5 months prior. So now here we are. This is what's happening. And it really, every single year, it's not a matter of if that snow is going to facet and weaken. It's really a matter of degrees. How bad is it going to be? Is it just going to be a lot bad or a little bad? And then what that often looks like is this. You can see the granular, weak faceted snow on the bottom half of the snowpack and then the new snow on top. That new snow is the slab itself. When that weak layer fractures, that new snow on top slides downhill, and that makes the avalanche. So one way I like to think about it, and it's a nice simple model, a lot of forecasters use it, and through that simplicity I think we can find some clarity, and that is just to think in really simple terms of stress versus strength. That slab on top has a certain amount of weight, and that adds stress. That weak layer has a certain amount of strength, and all season long it'll be a balancing act, a tug of war between the stress versus strength. So we often form this weak snow, and I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to talk about more the slab above and how that evolves. We get that weak snow, and then slowly we start adding snow on top of it. We start adding stress and adding stress. And then at a certain point, we'll add enough stress that it tips the scales. And when that weak layer fractures, we get avalanches. And often, like we saw last year, they'll start out small. And that's kind of the carrot, the canary in the coal mine. We'll see these small avalanches, and it's the writing on the wall as to what's to come. As more snow piles up, these avalanches will start breaking deeper. As that slab gets thicker and stronger and more cohesive, avalanches will break over farther areas. And what's going on is the reason we get avalanches, it comes back to that balancing act for stress versus strength. And it depends on how much stress we add and how quickly we add it. If that happens, we can tip the scales and then we get avalanches. But here's what happens. Throughout the season, snow is constantly changing. And as we add a little bit of stress, that weak snow can gain a little bit of strength. We can add a little bit more stress, it can gain a little bit more strength, and we can keep going like that for quite a while until eventually later in the season we can get a giant slab sitting on top of it. And we reach this point, it depends on how much the storms that come in. This can happen in January or February or even in March when I took this picture. Now when we reach this point, there are two things that make the situation really tricky. One is that because that slab is so big and thick, these avalanches are really difficult to trigger. Not only that, you can trigger them from all sorts of places that you wouldn't expect. You might be down in the flats below, off to the side, or right in the middle of it. You just never know. It's hard to find that spot because that slab is so thick. Secondly, the danger rating includes an element of how easy these avalanches are to trigger and how likely they will be. So throughout the season, the avalanche danger can be going up and down. But these avalanches, as that slab grows and grows and grows, the consequences, or the deadliness or the destructiveness, continues to climb and goes through the roof. So we're left with a situation sometimes where the avalanche danger can be going down, but the consequences are going up. This avalanche happened in 2009 and killed a friend of mine. The slab in this one was 10 to 15 feet thick. And what's notable is that this slope was covered in tracks before it released. Travis just happened to find that wrong spot where he could trigger it. And even last year here in Utah, a lot of you might remember the Wilson Glades accident that we just saw in the season review. This is a photo of that slope moments before it avalanched. There were 14 sets of ski tracks on it before it was finally triggered. So back to my slope and the avalanche that almost killed me. I was swept downhill instantly. I was tumbling in the snow. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. I had snow jammed down my throat. I couldn't breathe. It was like being in a washing machine. And as quickly as it began, it ended, and I was spit out onto the debris, just sitting there on top, uninjured and not buried. I was incredibly lucky. At the time, I was in graduate school, working on my master's degree in engineering, studying snow and avalanches, so naturally I just started searching for answers, studying the fracture mechanics, trying to figure out what we missed, what went wrong. Was it the collapse? Why did we trigger it on the way down and not the way up? And through all that, what I realized is that the answer wasn't in the math and the science and the complexities and the nuances. The answer was really simple. It had been a really bad avalanche season. And that weak layer had been producing avalanches all season long, and it made perfect sense why it made one for me. So that brings us to this tree in my backyard. It turns out it's an apricot tree. I had no idea because for a few years it didn't make any fruit until one year it was full of apricots. And then other years it doesn't make any, and some it makes a moderate crop. And then just this summer there were tons of them. I was totally confused, so I turned to Brett Kobernick, who's our forecaster down on the Manti skyline, and he happens to grow cherries in the summer, and he knows about fruit trees. And he said, well, that all depends on the weather. He said, you can get a late season frost, a late season snowstorm. You can get a warm spring, a cold summer, too much rain, too little rain, rain at the wrong time. And all those things can affect how or what type of apricot season it is. Do I get a lot or do I get none at all? And the snowpack is exactly the same. There are many combinations of weather that will determine what kind of avalanche season we get. And depending on how that plays out, we can either have a good year for avalanches or a bad year for avalanches. Now the advantage with my apricot tree is I can walk out my yard and I can see it. I can see those buds, I can see the young fruit, I can walk out and see if my tree is full of juicy, sweet apricots. I don't have to know anything about fruit trees. I can just walk out and see it with my eyes if it's been a good apricot year. If it's been a bad avalanche year, by looking at this slope, I can't tell. The only way I know is by tracking and following the history of the snowpack, knowing has it been producing avalanches. If you read the forecast every day, will help you know that. And the main point I want you to remember is to think in terms of entire seasons, not next week, not next month. Just like on my avalanche and my apricot tree, if it's a bad avalanche season, be prepared to maybe wait until next season. Because for me, this is what I want to do until I'm really old. And if I have to wait until next season, I'll do it. If I have to wait until the season after that, I'm going to do it. I'm going to play for the long game because ultimately at the end of the day, I want to get home to my wife and my 3 boys because they are what matter most. So, thank you for listening. Please remember my apricot tree when you're out riding this winter, and let's pray for a good avalanche season.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Mark. Got a couple questions in the queue, so we're going to start off with this one. Mark, during your time in Utah, have you noticed any sort of changing trends with early season snow patterns in this time that you've been here?
Well, that's a good question, and the short answer is you'll have to ask me in 10 or 20 years what those patterns were. What I can say is I'm not surprised when I see early season snow and it becomes weak and faceted. That's the norm, and when it doesn't, we're happy.
Very good. We got another one queued up, and it's with the early storms followed by mild weather this year so far. Are we potentially looking at a similar heat crust that would mimic last season?
Well, right now, I wouldn't say we're looking at a similar heat crust. I'd say we're looking at a very dense, strong snowpack, but it's only the beginning of November. There are some facets forming on the surface. We're getting a little snow right now, and guaranteed, I have been fooled so many times when I've thought we have a deep, strong snowpack. And as you move into November and December, and you get those crisp, cold nights when the temperatures plummet, that'll chew through any snowpack no matter how solid it is. So really, it matters. We're looking good now, but what we need is consistent storms, cloudy nights, and not these long periods of high pressure.
Yeah, so remember, following the forecast each day, right? It's like checking out all of the different characters in the book. Every time you turn the page, right? If we're unfamiliar with those characters, we're going to be lost in the midsection of the book. So definitely take that to heart. Check in even those days that you don't plan on riding, because it's going to give you a leg up as we progress into the winter. So Mark, I've got a question for you. What type of weather can heal these early season snowpack issues?
Well, we want consistent snow, and if you remember in that video of the season review, Trent was standing at a snowpack about this deep. And the way to heal that snow, if that's how things pan out, and we get faceted snow to the ground, we want to bury it, and we want to insulate it, and we want to give it time. We remove that temperature gradient and let it sit there, and through time, and I can't stress that enough, we have to give it time. It can slowly heal. The problem is, and the deck is stacked against us, because that snow can facet like that, and then it takes a long time to heal. It can happen, but so fingers crossed.
Yeah, time is the healer of so many things, right? So, Mark, do you have any suggestions for individuals on how they can track these patterns on their own?
Yeah, tracking these patterns, that's huge. I would say the number one thing is to track the avalanche activity. We have a section on our forecast page, recent avalanches. Read that every day. You can go into all the avalanche obs, read through the avalanches, and the ultimate question you're trying to answer, Bruce is right here behind the camera, and he would be saying to me, Mark, what are the avalanches doing? So keep track of those on our website. Any other forecast center will be letting you know what the avalanches are doing, and that is the number one thing you want to know. Isn't that right, Bruce?
Yeah, the biggest sign of unstable snow, right? Nature's biggest freebie, recent avalanche activity. So take that to the bank. Yeah, you can totally rest your hat on that. And Mark, for these bigger deep slabs, what kind of tests do you think snow stability tests are most applicable?
Well, some friends of mine like to joke that there's the CT, the ECT, but what really counts is TNT. They're ski patrollers. But because that slab is so thick, even explosives don't do that much. And what a lot of us fall back on, there's a lot of really cool research being done, but we always come back to that stress versus strength, and we look at the loading. So if that snow has been sitting for some time, the danger can go down and they can get harder to trigger. A lot of veterans will say, I don't care. These avalanches are so big and destructive, I'm just not going into avalanche terrain if that layer exists at the ground. Otherwise, when we're trying to assess this, really the number one thing we're looking at is loading. So anytime you bump up that stress, you bump up that stress, if it's going to exceed the strength of that weak layer down below, then we'll get avalanches. The trouble is that there's a lot about avalanches we don't know, and sometimes we just don't exactly know where that tipping point is. So you want to have a wide margin of safety.
And we got time for one more, and this is great that everybody's feeding these into the queue. So remember, you can just text those as the speaker is delivering their presentation. That way we get them front loaded. So last question, Mark, is there a resource to easily discern weather history, like a catalog of reports or observations that you can suggest?
We do maintain some weather charts on our website under the weather page, under the forecast. You can look at those. A lot of people, and one thing I would suggest doing, the way you can really learn, is just keep a little notebook. It doesn't have to be that detailed, but just kind of keep track of notable storms, wind events, anything you pick out from the forecast, And if you do that, instead of just reading something that someone else has produced, it'll really sink in, and you'll ultimately start to be able to map what you're seeing with the weather with the avalanche activity. And by just making some notes and keeping a small journal, I think that would really be the best way to connect those dots.